My husband stood up during my birthday toast and announced our divorce to 50 guests. Freedom at last, he laughed, raising his champagne glass. I smiled, walked to the microphone, and told his entire family about his affair with his secretary. His mother fainted into the cake. "Happy birthday to my soon-to-be ex-wife," Corey Evans declared to the crowded backyard, his voice carrying that familiar tone of manufactured charm mixed with cruelty. He held his champagne flute high, the golden liquid catching the string lights I'd hung myself just hours before. Here's to new beginnings and better choices.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
The silence that followed was deafening. 50 faces turned toward me, expressions ranging from confusion to horror. My sister Marianne's mouth hung open. His brother Michael looked like he'd been slapped. Even the catering staff had stopped serving and were staring. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't run to the bathroom in humiliation like he expected. Instead, I stood up slowly, smoothed down my crimson-red dress, the one he'd called too attention-seeking when I put it on that morning, and walked toward the small stage we'd rented for the DJ. My heels clicked against the wooden deck with measured precision. Each step felt like reclaiming territory that had been stolen from me. "Thank you, Corey," I said, taking the microphone from the DJ's stand. My voice was steady, almost conversational. "Since we're sharing announcements tonight, I have one too." The crowd leaned forward. Corey's smug smile slickered slightly, but he still looked confident. After all, what could I possibly say that would match his theatrical cruelty? He'd spent months planning this moment, orchestrating it like a director staging a play. The birthday party had been his idea. "Let's make it special," he said. "Invite everyone, your whole family, all our friends. It'll be a night to remember." He was right about that. "I want to thank everyone for coming to celebrate my 32nd birthday," I continued, my voice warming as I looked out at the faces of people who loved me. "It means so much to have you all here. And since Corey has decided to make this evening about honesty and new beginnings, I think his family should know the truth about why our marriage is ending." Now Corey's smile vanished entirely. He set down his champagne glass and took a step toward me, but I held up my free hand, a gentle but firm gesture that stopped him in his tracks. "For the past 8 months," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent yard, "Corey has been having an affair with his secretary, Amanda Coleman. They've been meeting at the Marriott downtown every Tuesday and Thursday. She's 24, blonde, and according to the text messages I found, apparently much better at understanding his needs than his boring old wife." The reaction was immediate and visceral. His mother, Sheila Evans, made a choking sound and reached for her chair. His father, William, went pale as paper. Michael's girlfriend, Eva, actually gasped out loud. My own family looked stunned, but not entirely surprised. They'd never liked Corey anyway. But it was Sheila's reaction that truly satisfied me. She'd spent years making subtle digs about my cooking, my career, my inability to give her grandchildren yet. She'd taken every opportunity to remind me that Corey was quite the catch, and that I was lucky to have him. Now she was staring at her precious son like he'd grown a second head. "The hotel receipts are quite interesting reading," I continued, pulling my phone from my clutch. "Would you like me to share some of the more romantic text exchanges? There's one where he calls her his Tuesday treat that I think everyone would find particularly touching." "Bridget, stop," Corey said, his voice cracking slightly. He'd finally found his tongue, but the damage was already done. The crowd was buzzing with whispered conversations, shocked murmurs, and the occasional sharp intake of breath. "Oh, I'm just getting started," I replied sweetly. "Did you know that he charged their romantic getaway to Vermont on our joint credit card? The same card I use for groceries and gas while he's off playing house with someone young enough to be his daughter." Sheila Evans made another strangled sound and suddenly pitched forward. For a moment, I thought she was lunging at me, but then I realized she was fainting. She fell directly into the 3-tiered chocolate cake I'd special ordered from the bakery across town, the one with Happy Birthday Bridget written in elegant script across the top. The chocolate frosting exploded across her cream-colored blouse and pearls. Her husband, William, rushed to help her up, but she was conscious and furious, chocolate dripping from her perfectly styled silver hair. "Is this true?" she shrieked at Corey, frosting sliding down her cheek. "Are you cheating on your wife with some child?" The word child came out like a curse. Sheila Evans, for all her faults, had raised 3 sons with old-fashioned values. Adultery was not something she tolerated, especially not from her eldest son, when she'd always considered the responsible one. Corey opened and closed his mouth like a fish, gasping for air. His face had gone from confident to confused to panicked in the span of 30 seconds. This wasn't how his script was supposed to go. "Mom, it's complicated," he stammered. "You don't understand the situation. Bridget and I, we've grown apart. She's not the same person I married." "So you decided to solve that by sleeping with your secretary?" This came from Michael, Corey's younger brother, who was standing with his arms crossed and a look of pure disgust on his face. "At family gatherings, you always acted like you were better than the rest of us, Mr. Perfect with his perfect marriage." I watched the family dynamic shift in real time. Corey had always been the golden child, the successful one with the beautiful wife and the corner office. But now his pedestal was crumbling, and his family was seeing him for what he really was, a coward who'd chosen public humiliation over private conversation. The best part was that I hadn't had to lie, hadn't had to exaggerate, hadn't even had to raise my voice. I'd simply told the truth, calmly and clearly, while he stood there in his designer suit looking like exactly what he was, a man who'd underestimated his wife and overestimated his own cleverness. As I looked out at the chaos he'd created, his mother covered in cake, his family staring at him in horror, our friends whispering and pointing, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. This wasn't the end of the story. This was just the beginning of mine. But let me tell you how I really found out. It wasn't through detective work or suspicious behavior. It was through sheer stupid luck and Corey's complete inability to manage his own arrogance. 3 weeks before my birthday party, I was at his office building for our monthly lunch date, a tradition I'd been trying to maintain despite the growing distance between us. I was early, as usual, sitting in the marble lobby reading emails on my phone when I heard familiar laughter echoing from the elevator bank. Corey's laugh, but not the polite, professional chuckle he used in meetings. This was his genuine laugh, the one I hadn't heard directed at anything I'd said in months, the one that used to make my stomach flutter when we were dating. I looked up and saw him stepping out of the elevator with a young blonde woman I didn't recognize. She was everything I wasn't anymore, bubbly, animated, wearing a fitted red dress that screamed confidence. Her hand brushed his arm as she spoke, and he leaned in like her words were the most fascinating thing he'd ever heard. "See you Tuesday," she said, loud enough for her voice to carry across the lobby. "Same time, same place?" "Wouldn't miss it," he replied, and that's when he saw me. The change in his expression was instant and telling. The warm smile vanished, replaced by the polite mask he'd been wearing around me for months. He straightened his tie and walked toward me with measured steps, like a man approaching a business meeting he'd rather avoid. "Bridget," he said, bending to kiss my cheek. His lips barely grazed my skin. "You're early," I asked, nodding toward the blonde who was now at the reception desk signing something on a clipboard. "Amanda Coleman," he said without hesitation. "New secretary, very efficient. Shall we go?" He was lying. I could tell because he'd used that same casual tone when he told me he was working late, when he explained away the unexplained charges on our credit card, when he said he was too tired for dinner out but too wired to sleep. It was the voice of a man who'd practiced his deceptions until they sounded like truth. But what struck me most wasn't the lie itself. It was how easily it came. No pause, no consideration, no guilt. Just smooth, practiced dishonesty delivered with a smile. At lunch, I watched him check his phone 3 times. Each buzz made him perk up slightly, then glance at me with what I now recognize was calculation. He was measuring how much attention he needed to pay me to avoid suspicion while mentally composing responses to someone else.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Everything okay?" I asked after the third interaction. "Just work," he said, sliding the phone face down across the table. "You know how it is." I did know how it was. I knew because I'd been watching him grow more distant for months, had felt him pulling away in increments so small I'd convinced myself I was imagining it. But sitting there in that restaurant, watching him lie to my face with the same mouth that had kissed me goodbye that morning, I realized I hadn't been imagining anything. I'd been in denial. After lunch, I walked back to my car with a strange feeling in my chest. Not quite heartbreak, not quite anger, but something sharper. Clarity, maybe. For the first time in months, the fog of confusion and self-doubt lifted, and I could see the situation clearly. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I asked him directly about his day. "How was work?" I said, as he loosened his tie in our bedroom. "Anything interesting happen?" "The usual," he replied, not meeting my eyes. "Meetings, phone calls, paperwork, nothing worth mentioning." He didn't mention Amanda Coleman, didn't mention their conversation about Tuesday, didn't mention the way she'd touched his arm or the way he'd smiled at her like she hung the moon. I nodded and went to take a shower, and that's when I heard his phone buzz again. Through the bathroom door, I could hear him answer it immediately. "Hey," he said, his voice dropping to the intimate tone he used to reserve for me. "No, she's in the shower. We can talk." I stood under the hot water, letting it run over my face while I listened to the murmur of his voice through the wall. I couldn't make out words, but I could hear the warmth, the affection, the engagement that had been missing from our conversations for months. When I came out, he was already in bed, phone charging on his nightstand, acting like nothing had happened. "Good shower?" he asked without looking up from his book. "Perfect," I replied. That night, lying beside him in the dark, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront him. I wasn't going to demand answers or stage dramatic confrontations or beg him to choose me over her. I was going to find out exactly what I was dealing with, and then I was going to handle it on my terms. The old Bridget might have cried herself to sleep. The old Bridget might have searched his phone at 3 a.m. or called his office pretending to be a client. The old Bridget might have blamed herself, wondered what she'd done wrong, tried harder to win back his attention. But that night, a new Bridget was born, one who understood that knowledge was power, that patience was a weapon, and that the best revenge wasn't getting nad, it was getting even. I started planning the next morning. Not his downfall, not yet. First, I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. I needed evidence. I needed leverage. I needed to know exactly how deep this betrayal went before I decided how to respond to it. And I had a feeling my 32nd birthday party was going to be the perfect venue for that response. The affair wasn't the beginning of our problems. It was just the latest chapter in a story that had been writing itself for 3 years, ever since Corey got his promotion to regional manager and decided he was too important for the life we'd built together. It started with small things, comments that felt like paper cuts, sharp enough to sting, but too minor to bandage. "You might want to think about updating your wardrobe," he'd say while I got dressed for his company events. The other wives dress more professionally. I'd look down at my dress, something I'd felt confident in moments before, and suddenly see it through his eyes. Too bright, too casual, too me. So I bought new clothes. Understated pieces and neutral colors that photographed well and offended no one. I traded my collection of vintage jewelry for simple pearl studs. I started wearing my hair in a sleek bun instead of the loose waves I preferred. Slowly, systematically, I erased myself and replaced her with someone more suitable for a regional manager's wife. The dinners were worse. Corey loved hosting dinner parties for his colleagues and their spouses, elaborate affairs where he could showcase our renovated kitchen and his impressive wine collection. I'd spend days planning menus, coordinating schedules, polishing silver that belonged to his grandmother. But during these events, I became invisible. Not literally, I was there, refilling glasses and ensuring everyone had enough appetizers. But conversationally, professionally, personally, I might as well have been the hired help. Bridget used to work in marketing, Corey would say when someone asked about my career, using the past tense like I'd died. But she's taking a break to focus on the home. I wasn't taking a break. I was freelancing for 3 different agencies, building a client base while working from our converted spare bedroom. But that work didn't fit the narrative he wanted to tell about our life, so it simply didn't exist in his version of our story. The worst part was how he'd touch me during these performances, his hand on my lower back, guiding me away from conversations that were getting too interesting. His arm around my waist, a gesture that looked affectionate but felt possessive. A squeeze of my shoulder that said, "That's enough," when I'd been talking too long or too passionately about something he deemed inappropriate. I started dreading these gatherings, the careful choreography of playing the perfect wife while my actual thoughts and opinions were systematically dismissed or redirected. The way other women would look at me with a mixture of pity and relief. Pity that I'd been so diminished, relief that it wasn't happening to them. "You were quiet tonight," he'd say afterward as we loaded the dishwasher. "I was tired," I'd reply. "Carl's wife was asking about your work. I told her you were considering some part-time consulting." Considering? Like my thriving freelance business was a hobby I might pick up when I got bored of arranging flowers and organizing his sock drawer. The intimacy disappeared gradually. First it was, "I'm exhausted from work." Then it was, "I have early meetings." Then it was, separate bedrooms, because his sleep schedule was too important to compromise. I told myself it was temporary. Successful men work hard. Relationships go through phases. This was just a rough patch that would smooth out once his career stabilized. But it didn't stabilize, it accelerated. More promotions, more responsibilities, more reasons why my needs came second to his professional image. More dinners where I smiled and nodded while he explained my own life to other people. More mornings where he left without saying goodbye, and more evenings where he came home too late for conversation. I started noticing how other couples interacted at these events. How Michael Curtis looked at his wife Eva when she spoke, like her words mattered. How William Olson's hand found his wife, not to control her, but to connect with her. How they had inside jokes and shared glances, and the kind of easy intimacy that Corey and I used to have. "Maybe you should talk to someone," my sister Marianne suggested during one of our monthly coffee dates. "A counselor, someone neutral." "Talk about what?" I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. "About how you're disappearing," she said gently. "About how every time I see you, there's a little less of you there." I wanted to defend him, to explain that he was under a lot of pressure, that success required sacrifices. But sitting there in the coffee shop, watching Marianne's concerned expression, I realized I couldn't remember the last time Corey had asked me about my work, my thoughts, my dreams, or my day in any meaningful way. The conversation had become a series of logistics. Who was picking up the dry cleaning? What time his mother was coming for dinner? Whether I'd remembered to RSVP for his boss's retirement party. We'd become roommates who shared a mortgage and a last name, but had somehow stopped sharing a life. That's when I started keeping a journal. Not the pretty kind with inspirational quotes, but a plain notebook where I documented the small erosions of our relationship. The way he'd interrupt me mid-sentence to take calls, the way he'd critique my appearance before we left for social events, the way he'd make decisions about our shared life without consulting me. I told myself I was being dramatic, that I was overreacting to normal relationship challenges. But the journal pages filled up quickly with examples of behavior that individually seemed minor, but collectively painted a picture of a man who'd stopped seeing his wife as an equal partner. The night I found the hotel receipts, I wasn't even looking for evidence of an affair. I was doing taxes, organizing our financial documents, when I found charges that didn't match any business trips I knew about. 3 different hotels over the past 6 months, all charged to our joint credit card on weekdays when he'd told me he was working late. I sat at our kitchen table, staring at those receipts, and felt something shift inside me. Not heartbreak, that would come later. This was something colder, sharper. This was the moment I stopped making excuses for him and started paying attention to what was actually happening in my marriage. That's when I decided to throw myself the birthday party he'd been suggesting for months. The big celebration with all our friends and family that he'd been pushing for, claiming he wanted to show everyone how much you mean to me. I finally understood why he wanted that party so badly. He needed an audience for what he was planning to do. The isolation didn't happen overnight. It was so gradual, so carefully orchestrated that I didn't realize how small my world had become until I tried to plan my guest list and realized I barely had one. "Who should we invite?" Corey asked one evening, scrolling through his phone contacts while I sat across from him with a blank notepad. "Obviously my family, the work crowd, your sister." "What about Jenny?" I suggested, "and Sarah from my old job, and the book club girls?" He looked up from his phone with that expression I'd learned to recognize, the one that meant he was about to gently redirect me away from something he didn't approve of. "Jenny's great," he said carefully, "but didn't she just go through that messy divorce? Might bring down the mood. And Sarah," he paused, pretending to consider, "wasn't she the one who made those comments about marriage being outdated at Carl's wedding?" I hadn't remembered Sarah saying anything like that, but Corey had a way of remembering conversations differently than I did. He'd recall cutting remarks and inappropriate comments that somehow I'd missed entirely, painting my friends as drama-seeking or negative influences that he was protecting me from. "The book club might be tricky too," he continued. "Didn't you say they spend most of their time complaining about their husbands instead of actually discussing books?" I had said that, once, after a particularly frustrating meeting where Sheila Curtis had spent an hour detailing her husband's failure to load the dishwasher properly. But the way Corey repeated it made my friends sound petty and vindictive, when they were actually smart, accomplished women who occasionally needed to vent about domestic life. "What about my college friends?" I tried. "From out of state? That's a lot of travel for a birthday party. Maybe we should keep it local, intimate, quality over quantity." By the time we finished planning, my half of the guest list included my sister Marianne, my parents, and exactly 3 other people. His half took up 2 pages. This was how it happened with everything. He never forbade me from maintaining friendships or pursuing interests. He just made it complicated, made it seem unreasonable, made me feel selfish for wanting things that didn't directly benefit our shared image. When I wanted to take a pottery class, he worried about the time commitment affecting my availability for his work events. When I suggested a girls' weekend with my college roommates, he reminded me about the expense and how behind we were on home improvements. When I got excited about a freelance project with a new client, he'd point out how much energy I was putting into other people's businesses instead of focusing on our relationship. None of these concerns were unreasonable on their own. Taken individually, they showed a partner who was practical, financially responsible, and wanted to spend time with his wife. But collectively, they formed a pattern that systematically eliminated every part of my life that didn't revolve around him. I stopped calling my friends because every plan became a negotiation. I stopped pursuing new projects because the excitement was always met with subtle skepticism. I stopped talking about my interests because they were consistently reframed as distractions from more important priorities. The worst part was how logical he made it all sound. When I felt isolated, he'd remind me that we had each other. When I felt professionally unfulfilled, he'd point out how successful his career was becoming and how that benefited both of us. When I missed my old social life, he'd organize dinner parties where I could entertain in a way that complemented his professional goals. "You're so lucky," Sheila Evans would say at these gatherings, watching me refill wine glasses while Corey held court in the living room. "He's so successful, so devoted to providing for you. You get to focus on the home instead of dealing with office politics and deadlines." Lucky. I was lucky to have my world shrunk to the size of our 4-bedroom house. Lucky to have my identity reduced to Corey's wife in every social situation. Lucky to be provided for by a man who'd slowly but systematically eliminated every part of me that existed independently of him. My sister noticed first. When's the last time you did something just for yourself? Marianne asked during one of our increasingly rare coffee dates. I do lots of things for myself, I protested. Name one from this week. I opened my mouth, then closed it. I'd organized a dinner party for Corey's colleagues. I'd researched vacation destinations for our upcoming anniversary trip, destinations that fit his budget and schedule preferences. I'd spent 3 hours cooking his favorite meal for a quiet night in. But something just for me? Something that fed my soul instead of maintaining our life together? I couldn't think of a single thing. He's not controlling, I said defensively. He just has opinions about things. He wants what's best for us. Marianne studied my face for a long moment. When did you start needing permission to have opinions of your own? I don't need permission, I snapped, but even as I said it, I realized how untrue it was. I'd been asking for his input on everything from my hair color to my lunch plans. I'd been seeking his approval for decisions I used to make automatically. I'd been editing myself so thoroughly that I'd forgotten what my unedited thoughts even sounded like. That night, I tried an experiment. I told Corey I wanted to redecorate our bedroom, something I'd been thinking about for months but hadn't mentioned because I knew he'd have strong opinions about cost and timing and whether it was really necessary. Redecorate how? He asked, not looking up from his laptop. Maybe some new colors, that sage green I like, some different art. Now he looked up. The bedroom looks fine. We just painted it 2 years ago. That was beige, I said. Everything in this house is beige. Beige is classic, timeless. It photographs well. For who? Are we selling the house? He closed his laptop and gave me the patient look he usually reserved for explaining complex work situations to people who wouldn't understand. Bridget, we've built something really nice here. Our home reflects who we are as a couple. Why would we want to change that? Who we are as a couple? Not who I was as a person living in the space. Not what would make me happy or comfortable or inspired. Who we were as a unit, which apparently was beige and timeless and photogenic. I dropped the redecorating idea, but I didn't drop the realization that had come with it. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being a person and started being half of an image. The question was whether Corey had noticed the difference or if he'd simply preferred it this way all along. The breaking point came 3 days before my birthday at William Olson's retirement dinner. It was one of those mandatory social events that came with Corey's position, not quite personal enough to skip, not quite professional enough to enjoy. I'd spent an hour getting ready, choosing a navy dress that struck the right balance between elegant and understated. I'd even bought new earrings for the occasion, small sapphire studs that made me feel like myself again, even if I couldn't quite remember who that was anymore. You look beautiful, Corey said as we walked into the restaurant, his hand on my lower back in that possessive way I'd grown to hate. Very appropriate. Appropriate. Not beautiful, not stunning, not like he couldn't keep his eyes off me. Appropriate. Like I was a well-chosen accessory that complemented his outfit. The dinner was held at Morrison's, an upscale steakhouse with dark wood paneling and leather banquettes. The kind of place where successful men took other successful men to celebrate their achievements. Wives were invited, but not really included, expected to smile and nod while the real conversations happened around them. I found myself seated between Carl Smith's wife and Michael Curtis, while Corey held court 3 seats away, regaling the table with a story about his latest client acquisition. He was animated, charming, fully present in a way I hadn't seen him be at home in months. "How's the freelance work going?" Eva Curtis asked quietly, leaning toward me during a lull in the men's conversation. "Really well, actually," I said. "I just landed a contract with a tech startup that could be really exciting. They want me to completely rebrand their digital presence, and the creative freedom they're giving me is incredible." "That sounds amazing," she said. "What kind of timeline are you looking at?" 6 months, maybe 8. It's a substantial project, definitely the biggest thing I've taken on. The pay is excellent too, which means I might actually be able to— Bridget. Corey's voice cut across our conversation like a blade. The entire table turned to look at me. "Are you boring Eva with work talk?" The way he said it, with that indulgent smile that didn't reach his eyes, made my cheeks burn, like I was a child who'd forgotten her manners at a grown-up dinner. Not at all, Eva said quickly. I was asking about her business. It sounds really successful. Oh, it's just a little side project, Corey said, waving his hand dismissively. Something to keep her busy while I'm traveling for work. Nothing too serious. Nothing too serious? The contract that represented 8 months of work, a significant income boost, and the chance to build something meaningful was nothing too serious? I felt something crack inside my chest. Not break, not yet, but develop a hairline fracture that I knew would spread if I didn't do something to stop it. Actually, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, it's a $60,000 contract, which is hardly a side project. The silence that followed was deafening. Corey's smile froze on his face. Around the table, I could see people exchanging glances, suddenly aware they'd stumbled into a marital minefield. Well, William Olson said heartily, clearly trying to redirect the conversation, that's wonderful, Bridget. Sounds like you're quite the entrepreneur. She is, Eva added firmly. That's a substantial contract. But Corey wasn't finished. 60,000 over 8 months, he said, his tone carefully measured, but his eyes flashing with something dangerous. Before taxes, of course. And that's assuming the startup doesn't fold, which, let's be honest, most of them do. He was diminishing my achievement in real time, in front of people who'd just heard me describe it as significant, making me look naive, unrealistic, like a child playing at having a business. Most startups fail in the first year, he continued, warming to his theme. The founder is 26, with no real experience. I've tried to explain the risks to Bridget, but she's got her heart set on it. Her heart set on it. Like I was being emotional instead of professional. Like I hadn't done my due diligence, hadn't researched the company, hadn't made a calculated business decision based on facts and market analysis. The company has solid backing, I said quietly, and the founder has 2 successful exits under his belt. If you say so, Corey replied, taking a sip of his wine. I just worry about you getting your hopes up. Getting my hopes up? About my own career, about work I was qualified to do, with clients who'd specifically sought me out based on my portfolio and reputation. The conversation moved on, but I stayed frozen in that moment, feeling the weight of what had just happened. He hadn't just disagreed with me or expressed concern about the project, he'd systematically undermined my credibility, my judgment, and my professional accomplishments in front of his colleagues. And he'd done it with a smile. The worst part was how familiar it felt. How many times had he done this at home, in smaller ways? How many of my ideas had been met with gentle skepticism that left me doubting my own judgment? How many of my successes had been reframed as lucky accidents or temporary diversions? As we drove home that night, Corey seemed oblivious to what had transpired. "Good dinner," he said cheerfully. "William's retirement speech was touching. Did you enjoy yourself?" I stared out the passenger window at the streetlights blurring past. "It was fine. You were quiet during dessert. Everything okay?" Everything okay? Like he hadn't just spent 10 minutes publicly dismantling my professional credibility. Like the humiliation I felt was imaginary, or at least irrelevant. "I'm tired," I said. When we got home, I went straight to our bedroom and closed the door. I sat on the edge of our bed, the bed in the beige room that photographed well, and finally let myself feel the full weight of what my marriage had become. I wasn't a partner. I was a supporting character in Corey's story about his own success. And tonight, for the first time, I tried to step out of that role and speak for myself. The result had been swift and decisive. I'd been reminded, in front of witnesses, exactly where I belonged. That was the night I decided to stop belonging there. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I lay in the dark, listening to Corey's steady breathing and planning my exit strategy with the same methodical approach I used for my most complex marketing campaigns. The first rule of any successful campaign is to know your audience.
In this case, my audience was a man who valued control above everything else, who had spent 3 years systematically diminishing my independence, and who was apparently planning to discard me in the most humiliating way possible at my own birthday party. The second rule is to understand the competitive landscape. Corey thought he held all the advantages: the higher income, the social connections, the family who adored him. He thought I was financially dependent, socially isolated, and too emotionally fragile to fight back. He was wrong on all 3 counts, but I was going to let him keep believing he was right. By 3 a.m., I had the outline of a plan. By morning, I was already putting it into motion. The first step was information gathering. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I could decide how to respond. So I did what any good strategist does when facing an opponent who underestimates them. I became invisible. For years, Corey had been treating me like a piece of furniture, present but not particularly important, functional but not worth paying attention to. Now, I was going to use that dismissiveness as camouflage. I started with his laptop. He'd always been careless about digital security around me, never bothering to hide his passwords or log out of accounts. Why would he? I was just his wife, interested in domestic concerns, not the kind of person who would know what to look for in email threads or calendar appointments. It took me less than 10 minutes to find the first piece of evidence: an email exchange with Amanda Coleman that started professionally but had evolved into something much more personal over the past 8 months. The timeline aligned perfectly with when he'd started working late, when our conversations had become purely logistical, when he'd stopped touching me like he meant it. The emails were a masterclass in workplace affair development. They started with project discussions and scheduling conflicts, evolved into shared jokes and complaints about other colleagues, then progressed to personal confidences and increasingly flirtatious banter. By month 4, they were meeting for lunch to discuss the Peterson account and coffee to review quarterly reports. By month 6, the emails were happening after hours and on weekends, full of inside jokes and casual intimacy that felt more natural than anything in my own marriage. The recent messages were the most damaging: references to hotel rooms, weekend getaways, and detailed complaints about me. According to Amanda, I was controlling, needy, and completely clueless about what's happening right under my nose.
According to Corey, I was a phase he was ready to move past. The divorce will be simple, he'd written just 2 weeks ago. She doesn't work full-time, doesn't have her own savings, doesn't even have many friends left. She'll take whatever settlement I offer because she won't have any other choice. I screenshotted everything. Not just the romantic messages, but the ones where they mocked my appearance, my career, my social awkwardness at his work events. The ones where they planned their future together and discussed the most efficient way to dispose of our marriage. The cruelest part wasn't the affair itself. It was how thoroughly they dissected and dismissed me. I wasn't a person whose feelings mattered. I was an obstacle to be managed and eventually removed. But their biggest mistake was assuming I was powerless. The laptop also revealed Corey's financial accounts, and that's where I found the second piece of crucial information. He'd been moving money, not embezzling or hiding assets exactly, but restructuring our shared finances in ways that would leave me with minimal access to our joint accounts if he filed for divorce. Over the past 6 months, he'd shifted most of our savings into accounts that only had his name on them. He'd changed the direct deposit for his salary to a new checking account I didn't know about. He'd even transferred ownership of our investment portfolio to a trust that listed him as the sole beneficiary. If I'd been the helpless, financially naive wife he thought I was, these moves would have left me with almost nothing. A few $1,000s in our joint checking account, half the value of a house that was mostly mortgaged, and whatever I could get from selling my car. But Corey had forgotten something important. I hadn't always been his wife. Before I met him, I'd been a successful marketing professional who understood contracts, negotiations, and risk assessment. And even though he'd spent 3 years making me doubt my own competence, I still knew how to read financial documents. More importantly, I still had my own money. The freelance work he'd dismissed as a side project had been generating steady income for 2 years. income that went into an account he'd never asked about because he'd never considered it significant enough to matter. Between that account and the $60,000 contract he'd mocked at dinner, I had enough financial independence to survive a divorce without accepting whatever scraps he was planning to offer. I spent the morning researching divorce lawyers while Corey was at work. Not just any lawyers, specifically attorneys who specialized in cases involving financial deception and hidden assets. I made appointments with 3 different firms for consultations, using my maiden name and paying with my personal credit card. I also did something I hadn't done in years. I called my old friend Sarah from my previous job, the one Corey had convinced me was negative and inappropriate for making comments about marriage being outdated. "Bridget," she said, her voice warm with genuine pleasure, "I was just thinking about you. How are you?" We talked for an hour about her work, her recent promotion, her new apartment downtown. She didn't ask about Corey, didn't mention my marriage, didn't treat me like half of a couple who only existed in relation to someone else. For the first time in months, I remembered what it felt like to be seen as an individual person with thoughts and opinions worth hearing. "We should get coffee," she said before we hung up. "I miss our brainstorming sessions. You always had the best insights on campaign strategy." Had, past tense, because I'd let Corey convince me that my professional skills were less important than his comfort level with my social choices. That evening, I cooked Corey's favorite dinner and listened to him complain about his workload while I planned my counterattack. He had no idea that his dismissive wife had spent the day assembling evidence, consulting attorneys, and reconnecting with the professional network he'd encouraged her to abandon. Let him think I was powerless. Let him think I was isolated and dependent. Let him think his plan to humiliate me at my own birthday party would succeed. I was going to let him get very, very close to victory before I reminded him exactly who he'd underestimated. The next morning, I became a detective in my own life. While Corey showered, I photographed every document in his home office, bank statements, investment portfolios, but credit card bills he'd started having sent to his work address. I uploaded everything to a secure cloud account using my maiden name, Bridget Curtis, the identity I'd almost forgotten existed. The financial picture was worse than I'd initially thought. He hadn't just been moving our money, he'd been spending it. The hotel receipts I'd found weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern going back almost a year. Weekend getaways to Napa Valley, expensive dinners at restaurants we'd never been to together, jewelry purchases that had never made it home to me. He'd been funding an entire relationship on our joint finances while letting me worry about whether we could afford to renovate the kitchen. But the most damaging evidence wasn't financial, it was digital. I'd installed a keylogger on our shared computer months ago, initially to recover a password I'd forgotten. I'd never removed it, and now I was grateful for that oversight. Every text message he'd typed, every email he'd composed, every online search he'd conducted was archived in a hidden folder. The searches were particularly revealing. How to file for divorce in California, spousal support minimization strategies, prenuptial agreement enforcement, and most telling, public divorce announcement etiquette. He'd been researching the most socially acceptable way to humiliate me. The text messages to Amanda were even more damaging than the emails because they were more immediate, less filtered. In them, Corey wasn't just cheating, he was cruel. He mocked my appearance after I'd spent hours getting ready for his company events. He complained about my clingy behavior when I asked about his weekend plans. He shared intimate details about our marriage that made me feel violated in ways I couldn't have imagined. But it was a message from 2 days ago that confirmed my worst suspicions. Tomorrow's dinner should be fun. Sunday's going to be even better. Can't wait to see her face when I drop the bomb at her party. Then we can finally stop sneaking around. Her response, "You're terrible. I love it. Think she'll cry?" His reply, "She'll definitely cry. Probably run to the bathroom. Very dramatic. But it'll be over quick, and then we can start our real life." I read that exchange 3 times, each pass making me feel colder and more focused. They weren't just planning to end my marriage. They were planning to entertain themselves with my pain. My humiliation was going to be the punchline to their love story. That afternoon, I drove to an electronics store and bought a small digital recorder, the kind private investigators use for surveillance. I spent an hour learning how to operate it, how to hide it, how to ensure the audio quality would be clear enough for legal purposes. Because if Corey wanted to make a public announcement, I was going to make sure there was a permanent record of it. I also made copies of everything: physical copies printed at a service center across town, digital copies stored in multiple locations, backups sent to an attorney's office for safekeeping. If Corey thought he could control the narrative by controlling access to evidence, he was about to learn how wrong he was. The hardest part was acting normal, cooking his dinner while knowing he was texting his mistress, asking about his day while knowing he'd spent it planning my public humiliation, lying in bed beside him while knowing he was mentally rehearsing the speech that would destroy our marriage in front of everyone we knew. But I'd gotten good at performing. 3 years of being the perfect wife had taught me how to smile when I felt like screaming, how to appear calm when my heart was racing, how to project contentment when my world was falling apart. The difference now was that I was performing by choice, not by conditioning. On Thursday evening, exactly 24 hours before my birthday party, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went shopping for myself. Not for clothes that would photograph well or jewelry that complemented Corey's image, but for something that made me feel powerful. I found it in a boutique I'd walked past 100 times but never entered because Corey preferred that I shop at department stores where my choices were safer. It was a red dress, not the understated burgundy or muted wine colors he approved of, but a true, brilliant red that made my skin glow and my eyes look fierce. "Special occasion?" the saleswoman asked as I tried it on. "You could say that," I replied, studying my reflection. For the first time in months, I looked like myself, not a muted, careful version designed to complement someone else, but the woman I'd been before I learned to shrink myself to fit into someone else's vision of who I should be. I bought the dress, a pair of matching heels that made me 2 inches taller, and earrings that caught the light when I moved. I also bought red lipstick in a shade called Truth Teller. When I got home, Corey was in his office on a video call with clients. I could hear him through the door, confident, articulate, completely in control of his professional world. Tomorrow night, he was planning to exercise that same control over our personal life. I hung my new dress in the back of our closet, behind the beige and navy pieces that had become my uniform. Then I sat down at my computer and began typing out exactly what I was going to say when he finished his announcement. I wasn't going to wing this. I wasn't going to rely on anger or adrenaline or righteous indignation. I was going to be as prepared and strategic as he was, except my strategy was based on truth instead of deception. By midnight, I had my speech memorized, every word, every pause, every piece of evidence I was going to present. I practiced it in the bathroom mirror until it felt natural, until I could deliver devastating information with the same calm professionalism Corey used in his business presentations. Tomorrow night, he was going to learn that underestimating your opponent is the first step toward losing the game. Friday morning, the day of my birthday party, I made a phone call that would change everything. Not to a lawyer, not to my sister, but to someone Corey had never met, and therefore couldn't manipulate or dismiss. "Curtis Investigations," the voice answered. Professional, crisp, exactly what I needed. "I need documentation services for this evening," I said, using the language I'd learned during my research. "A private event where I expect significant admissions to be made." Detective Marcus Curtis, no relation despite the shared surname, met me at a coffee shop 2 miles from our house. He was exactly what Central Casting would order for a private investigator: mid-50s, observant eyes, the kind of quiet competence that inspired confidence. "What kind of event are we talking about?" he asked after I'd explained the basic situation. "My birthday party. My husband is planning to announce our divorce publicly. I have reason to believe he'll make statements about our marriage, our finances, and his reasons for ending things. I need those statements documented by a neutral third party. And you're expecting him to incriminate himself?" "I'm expecting him to tell the truth for once because he thinks there are no consequences." Marcus nodded slowly. I can have two people there. Discreet, professional. They'll blend in as guests and record everything, audio and video, admissible in court if needed. The cost was substantial, $1,500 for the evening, but I paid it without hesitation, using the account Corey had never bothered to ask about. This was an investment in my future, and unlike his hotel receipts and jewelry purchases for his mistress, this expense was going to pay dividends. Next, I called my sister Marianne. I need you to do something for me tonight, I said without preamble, and I need you to trust me completely. What's going on? Corey's going to announce our divorce at the party. He's planned it as a surprise, a public humiliation. I'm going to let him do it, and then I'm going to respond. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then, Bridget, are you sure about this? Maybe we should cancel the party, have a conversation privately. He's been having an affair for 8 months, I interrupted. He's been moving our money into accounts I can't access. He's been planning this moment like a business presentation, right down to researching the most socially acceptable way to destroy someone's life in public. So no, we're not canceling the party. We're not having a private conversation. I'm going to let him have his moment, and then I'm going to have mine. What do you need me to do? Be ready to catch me if I fall apart afterward, and maybe have some tissues handy for his mother. I could hear her sharp intake of breath. You're going to tell Sheila? I'm going to tell everyone. If he wants to make our marriage public entertainment, then he gets to deal with the public consequences. My third call was to the caterer, ostensibly to confirm final details, but really to ensure that everything would proceed normally, even if the evening took an unexpected turn. I'd already paid in full, but I added a substantial tip for the staff and asked them to stay until the very end of the event, regardless of what might happen. Is there something specific we should be prepared for? The manager asked, clearly picking up on my tone. Just some family drama, I said. Nothing that should affect the service, but the evening might run longer than expected. I spent the afternoon in a strange state of calm focus, like an actor preparing for opening night of a play where I knew my lines but not how the audience would react. I did my nails in the same red as my dress, I practiced my speech one final time, I charged the small recorder and tested its range and clarity. At 4 o'clock, I received a text from Amanda Coleman. Thinking of you today, hope your party is everything you deserve. The audacity was breathtaking. She was going to watch my husband publicly humiliate me and had sent a passive-aggressive birthday wish disguised as sympathy. I screenshotted the message and added it to my growing collection of evidence. At 5:30, the catering staff arrived and began setting up our backyard. String lights, round tables with white linens, a small stage for the DJ that Corey had insisted we needed for announcements. I watched them work while I curled my hair, thinking about how he'd planned every detail of this evening to maximize his control over the narrative. At 6 o'clock, I put on the red dress and looked at myself in our bedroom mirror. The woman staring back at me looked nothing like the diminished, careful wife who'd been apologizing for taking up space for the past 3 years. This woman looked dangerous. At 6:15, Corey knocked on the bedroom door. Bridget, the first guests are here. You about ready? Almost, I called back, applying the truth-teller lipstick with steady hands. Great. And honey, I have a little surprise for you tonight. Something special. I can't wait, I replied, and for the first time in our marriage, I meant it exactly the way he was going to receive it. At 6:30, I walked downstairs to join my own birthday party, ready to watch my husband destroy our marriage in front of 50 witnesses, and ready to show him what real strategic planning looked like. The evening was about to begin, and for once, I knew exactly how it was going to end. The backyard looked perfect, magical even. White string lights created a canopy above the tables, casting everything in a warm golden glow. The catering staff moved efficiently between guests, offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres from silver trays. If I hadn't known what was coming, I might have been genuinely touched by the effort Corey had put into making this evening special. But I did know what was coming, and every beautiful detail felt like set decoration for my public execution. Bridget! Sheila Evans appeared at my elbow the moment I stepped outside, resplendent in cream silk and pearls, her silver hair styled in the same elegant chignon she'd worn to every social event I'd attended with her son. Darling, you look absolutely stunning. That dress is so bold. Bold? In Sheila's vocabulary, that was barely a step above inappropriate. But I smiled warmly and accepted her air kisses on both cheeks. Thank you, Sheila. I felt like celebrating. Well, 32 is such a lovely age. Still young, but mature enough to appreciate the good things in life. Her eyes swept over the party setup with approval. Corey has outdone himself with this. He was so excited about tonight, kept saying it was going to be a birthday you'd never forget. I'm sure it will be, I replied, accepting a champagne flute from a passing server. The irony of toasting with his mother wearing a wire recorder wasn't lost on me. The next hour passed in a blur of familiar social choreography. I moved through the crowd with practiced ease, thanking people for coming, admiring gifts, accepting compliments on the party setup and my dress. Everyone seemed in unusually high spirits, animated by the festive atmosphere and free-flowing champagne. My sister Marianne appeared at my side during a brief lull in conversations, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp with concern. "How are you holding up?" she asked quietly. "Perfectly," I said, and meant it. The strange calm that had settled over me that morning had only deepened as the evening progressed. I felt like I was watching everything from a slight remove, observing the social dynamics with clinical detachment. "You seem different tonight, more present." She was right. For the first time in years, I wasn't mentally editing every word before I spoke it, wasn't constantly monitoring Corey's reactions to gauge whether I was being appropriately supportive or sufficiently invisible. I was just being myself, the self I'd almost forgotten existed. Across the yard, I could see Corey holding court near the bar, entertaining a group of his colleagues with animated gestures and his most charming smile. He looked relaxed, confident, like a man about to achieve something he'd been working toward for a long time. Every few minutes, his eyes would find mine across the crowd, and he'd flash me a particularly warm smile. To anyone watching, he looked like a devoted husband celebrating his wife's special day. Only I knew he was savoring the anticipation of what he was about to do. At 8:30, the catering manager approached me discreetly. "Mrs. Evans, your husband asked me to let you know that he'd like to make a toast in about 15 minutes. Should I have the staff gather everyone around the stage area?" "Perfect timing," I said. "Yes, please go ahead and start directing people that way." As the crowd began to migrate toward the small stage, I caught sight of the two private investigators Marcus had sent. They blended perfectly with the other guests, a middle-aged couple who looked like they could be neighbors or family friends. The woman was even carrying a small clutch that could easily conceal recording equipment. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Equipment active, clear audio range established, you're all set." I deleted the message and dropped my phone back into my purse, next to the small recorder that had been capturing conversations all evening. Insurance, upon insurance, upon insurance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Corey's voice carried clearly across the yard as he stepped up to the microphone the DJ had set up. "If I could have everyone's attention, please. I'd like to say a few words about the birthday girl." The crowd gathered in a loose semicircle around the stage, champagne glasses in hand, faces upturned expectantly. I positioned myself near the front, close enough for everyone to see my reaction, but far enough away that I could move to the microphone quickly when my moment came. Corey looked out over the assembled guests with the confidence of a man who'd rehearsed this moment 100 times. His eyes found mine in the crowd, and he smiled with what anyone else would interpret as deep affection. 32 years ago today, he began, his voice warm and intimate through the sound system, the world got a little brighter when Bridget was born. A gentle murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd. Several people smiled at me fondly. His mother pressed a hand to her heart, clearly moved by her son's romantic gesture. We've been together for 7 years, married for 5, and I can honestly say that life with Bridget has been quite the adventure. Another wave of fond laughter. I kept my expression pleasantly neutral, though my heart was beginning to race with anticipation. But all adventures must come to an end, Corey continued, his tone shifting slightly, becoming more serious. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone you care about is to set them free to find their own path. The crowd's energy changed. People began glancing at each other uncertainly, picking up on the subtle shift in his tone even if they didn't yet understand what it meant. This was it, the moment he'd been planning, the grand finale of his performance. I gripped my champagne glass a little tighter and prepared to watch my husband destroy our marriage in front of 50 witnesses, knowing that in about 3 minutes, every person in that yard was going to understand exactly what kind of man they'd been celebrating. What I hadn't expected was for him to be cruel about it. I'd prepared for the divorce announcement. I'd anticipated the shock, the gasps, the uncomfortable silence that would follow. But I hadn't fully understood how much Corey was going to enjoy the moment, how much pleasure he was going to take in my anticipated humiliation. You see, he continued, his voice gaining confidence as he warmed to his theme, sometimes 2 people grow in different directions. Sometimes what you thought was love turns out to be, well, habit, convenience, the safe choice instead of the right choice. My sister's face had gone pale. I could see her gripping her husband's arm, her knuckles white with tension. Around the yard, the mood was shifting from celebratory to deeply uncomfortable as people began to realize they were witnessing something that shouldn't be happening in public. But Corey was just getting started. The truth is, he said, pausing for dramatic effect, I've realized what I married too young, settled too quickly. I convinced myself that companionship was the same thing as passion, that familiarity was the same thing as deep connection. Each word was a calculated strike. He wasn't just announcing our divorce, he was systematically dismantling our entire relationship, rewriting our history to cast himself as the victim of his own poor judgment, and me as the consolation prize he'd finally outgrown. So tonight, on Bridget's birthday, I want to give her the greatest gift I can think of, her freedom. The silence that followed was deafening. Someone in the back of the crowd made a sound that might have been a gasp or a sob. Sheila Evans looked like she'd been slapped, her mouth open in shock, one hand pressed to her chest. But Corey wasn't finished. He was savoring this moment, drawing it out like a virtuoso performer holding a high note. I know this comes as a surprise, he said, looking directly at me with what I now recognized as barely concealed satisfaction. But I've been thinking about this for a long time. We both deserve better than a marriage that's become more obligation than joy, more routine than romance. That's when I understood the full scope of his cruelty. He wasn't just leaving me, he was doing it in a way that would make me look pathetic. The blind-sided wife who hadn't seen the signs, who'd been so delusional about the state of her marriage that a public announcement was the only way to get through to her. He was counting on me to break down, to cry, to create the dramatic scene that would justify his narrative about our failed marriage. My tears would become evidence of my emotional instability. My shock would prove how out of touch I was with reality. I've already filed the papers, he continued, pulling a folded document from his jacket pocket with the flourish of a magician revealing the final trick. I wanted to make this official before we made it public. He held up the divorce petition like a prop, making sure everyone could see the legal seal, the official stamps that proved this wasn't just a cruel joke, but a calculated end to our marriage. Bridget? His voice took on a tone of false gentleness, the way you might speak to a confused child. I know this is a lot to process. Take your time. The crowd turned to look at me, 50 pairs of eyes waiting to see how the birthday girl would react to having her life destroyed in front of everyone she cared about. Some faces showed sympathy, others horror. A few barely concealed fascination with the drama unfolding in front of them. I could feel the weight of their expectations, the collective held breath as they waited for me to crumble, to provide the emotional climax Corey had orchestrated for their entertainment. Instead, I smiled. Not the careful, practiced smile I'd perfected over 3 years of hiding my true feelings, but a genuine expression of something that felt dangerously close to relief. "Thank you, Corey," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent yard. "That's very thoughtful of you." I saw confusion flicker across his face. This wasn't the script he'd written. I was supposed to be devastated, not grateful. "I have something for you, too," I continued, setting down my champagne glass and reaching into my purse. A birthday gift to myself, you might say. I pulled out my phone and held it up so everyone could see the screen. On it was a text message thread between Corey and Amanda Coleman, the one where they discussed making me cry at my own party, where they planned their future together while mocking my supposed cluelessness. "Since we're sharing tonight," I said, my voice warm and conversational, "I thought everyone should know the real reason Corey wants his freedom." The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might actually faint. This definitely wasn't in his script. "Her name is Amanda Coleman," I continued, looking out at the crowd with the same confidence he'd displayed moments before. "She's his secretary, 24 years old, blonde, and, according to these text messages I found, apparently much better at understanding his needs than his boring old wife." The gasp that rose from the crowd was audible this time. I heard Sheila Evans make a strangled sound that might have been my name. But I was just getting started. Because if Corey wanted to make our marriage public entertainment, then I was going to give our guests a show they'd never forget. "Now, I know what you're all thinking," I said, moving closer to the microphone as Corey stepped back, his face cycling through expressions of panic and calculation. "This must be some kind of misunderstanding. Corey would never cheat on his wife. He's such a devoted husband, such a family man." I could see him trying to regain control of the situation, his mouth opening to interrupt, but I held up my hand in the same gesture I'd used earlier, polite but firm. "Let me share some of my favorite messages," I continued, scrolling through my phone with theatrical deliberation. "Here's one from last Tuesday. Can't wait to get away from the house. She's been extra clingy lately. Makes me sick how needy she is." The crowd was completely silent now, the kind of silence that comes when people realize they're witnessing something historic and terrible. I could see phones coming out, people starting to record this moment for posterity. "Oh, and this one's from yesterday. Tomorrow's going to be perfect. Finally get to end this charade and start our real life together. Think she'll cry in front of everyone?" Sheila Evans made a sound like air being let out of a balloon. Her perfectly composed facade was cracking in real time, and I could see her looking at her son like she'd never seen him before. "She will definitely cry," I continued, reading Corey's response. "Probably run to the bathroom. Very dramatic, but it'll be over quick, and then we can start our real life." Michael Curtis, Corey's younger brother, was shaking his head slowly, his expression a mixture of disgust and disbelief. His wife, Eva, had her hand over her mouth, staring at Corey like he was a stranger. "But wait," I said, feigning surprise as I scrolled further. "There's more. Here's where they discuss their romantic getaway to Napa Valley last month, the one Corey told me was a work retreat." I held up my phone again, showing a photo Amanda had sent. Her and Corey in bathrobes at what was clearly an expensive resort, champagne glasses raised in a toast to the camera. "Best weekend ever," I read. "Can't believe she bought the work story. She's so trusting. It's almost sad." The word trusting hung in the air like an accusation. Around the yard, I could see people looking at each other with expressions that ranged from shock to anger to genuine sorrow. My friends and family weren't just witnessing the end of my marriage, they were watching the systematic destruction of my dignity, planned and executed for sport. "And here," I said, my voice gaining strength, "is my personal favorite, from 2 weeks ago when Amanda sent him a photo of the diamond bracelet he bought her, with our joint credit card." I held up another screenshot, this one showing a delicate tennis bracelet that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "It's perfect," I read, "just like you. Can't wait until I don't have to hide you anymore. Corey finally found his voice. Bridget, please. Please what? I interrupted, my tone still conversational, but with an edge that could cut glass. Please don't share the truth about our marriage. Please don't embarrass you in front of your family and friends. Please keep your secrets so you can continue this performance a little longer. I stepped closer to him, close enough that the microphone would pick up whatever he said in response. You wanted honesty tonight, Corey. You wanted to set me free. Well, consider me liberated. The crowd was beginning to murmur now, the shocked silence giving way to whispered conversations and angry exchanges. I could hear fragments. How could he? That poor woman. I can't believe. But it was his family's reactions that were most satisfying. William Evans, Corey's father, looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. The man who'd always been so proud of his successful eldest son was watching that success become tainted by moral failure in real time. Sheila was openly crying now, tears streaming down her cheeks as she stared at her son. How could you do this? She whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed yard. How could you humiliate your wife like this? How could you humiliate us? Mom, it's more complicated than, Corey started, but she cut him off with a gesture that was pure fury. Complicated? You've been cheating on your wife and planning to divorce her at her own birthday party for entertainment? What's complicated about that? Michael stepped forward, his face dark with anger. Jesus, Corey, what the hell is wrong with you? You don't understand, Corey began, but his brother was having none of it. I understand plenty. You're a coward and a cheat, and you thought you could get away with it because you figured Bridget was too weak to fight back. That's when I smiled again, the same genuine expression of satisfaction I'd felt earlier. Because Michael was absolutely right. Corey had counted on me being too weak, too shocked, too devastated to respond effectively. He'd planned this moment down to the smallest detail, anticipating every possible reaction, except the one that was actually happening. Actually, I said, raising my voice to address the entire crowd, there's one more thing you should all know about why Corey was so confident this evening would go according to his plan. I pulled the small digital recorder from my purse and held it up for everyone to see. This has been recording all evening, every conversation, every admission, every cruel comment, including the one he's about to make about how this is all my fault somehow. Corey's eyes went wide with something that looked like genuine terror, because he was finally beginning to understand that he'd brought a knife to a gunfight, and I'd been planning this counterattack for longer than he could imagine. You're recording this? Corey's voice cracked slightly, the smooth confidence he'd displayed moments before evaporating like steam. That's illegal. You can't record people without their consent. Actually, I said, still holding the device where everyone could see it, in California, only one party needs to consent to recording a conversation. And since I'm part of every conversation this device has captured, including the one where you just publicly announced our divorce, everything here is perfectly legal. The crowd was getting restless now, the initial shock giving way to anger and uncomfortable energy. People were starting to take sides, and it was becoming very clear which side was winning. Besides, I continued, I'm not the only one who's been documenting tonight. I gestured toward the private investigators, who were no longer bothering to blend in. The woman gave me a subtle nod, confirming that they'd captured everything on professional equipment. You hired spies? Corey's voice rose an octave, desperation bleeding through his attempts to maintain control. To your own birthday party? I hired witnesses, I corrected, because when someone plans to destroy your life in public, it's important to have a permanent record of exactly how they choose to do it. That's when he made his fatal mistake. Instead of apologizing, instead of trying to salvage some dignity from the wreckage of his plan, Corey decided to double down. Sign, he said, his voice hardening as he fell back on the personality traits that had served him well in business, but were about to destroy him in this moment. He stepped closer to the microphone, and I could see him shifting into the aggressive, dominating mode he used when he felt cornered. "You want to know the truth about our marriage?" he said, addressing the crowd like a prosecutor making a closing argument. "The truth is that I've been miserable for years. The truth is that Bridget has been emotionally manipulative, clingy, and completely unwilling to grow as a person." The gasps from the crowd were audible now, but not for the reasons he expected. People weren't shocked by his revelations about me. They were horrified by his willingness to continue attacking his wife in front of everyone who loved her. "The truth is," he continued, warming to his theme, "that she's been financially dependent on me, professionally stagnant, and so insecure that she's been monitoring my every move for months." "The truth," my sister Marianne said suddenly, her voice cutting through his monologue like a blade, "is that you're a pathetic excuse for a man." Corey whirled to face her, clearly not expecting to be interrupted. "I'm sorry?" "You heard me," Marianne said, stepping forward with the kind of protective fury that only siblings can muster. "You plan to humiliate my sister at her own birthday party. You've been cheating on her for months, and now you're trying to blame her for your own moral failures. You're pathetic." "She doesn't know what she's talking about," Corey said, but his voice lacked conviction. The crowd was turning against him so completely that even he could feel the shift. "Actually," said a voice from the back of the crowd, "I think she knows exactly what she's talking about." Everyone turned to see Carl Smith pushing through the gathered guests, his face grim with purpose. Carl worked with Corey, had been at every company event for the past 3 years, was part of the professional network Corey valued so highly. "Carl, thank God," Corey said, relief flooding his voice. "Finally, someone with some perspective on this situation." "Oh, I have perspective," Carl replied, his tone ice cold. "I have the perspective of someone who's had to listen to you mock your wife at every office gathering for the past year. I have the perspective of someone who's watched you flirt with your secretary at company functions while your wife smiled and played the perfect corporate spouse." The crowd was completely silent now, waiting to see how deep this betrayal went. "I have the perspective," Carl continued, "of someone who's been disgusted by your behavior for months but didn't know how to address it. Well, congratulations, Corey. You just provided all the proof anyone could ever need." "You don't understand," Corey started, but Carl cut him off. "I understand that you're about to become a very lonely man. Because after tonight, after everyone sees who you really are, you're going to find out exactly how many of your friendships were based on respect versus social obligation." That's when I realized that Corey's plan had backfired more completely than I dared to hope. He hadn't just exposed his affair, he'd revealed his character to every person who mattered in his social and professional life. He'd shown them that beneath the charming exterior was someone capable of calculated cruelty, someone who would humiliate his wife for entertainment. "Is it true?" Sheila Evans asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "About the secretary? About the planning?" Corey looked at his mother, and for a moment I thought he might finally show some remorse, some recognition of what he'd done. Instead, he shrugged. "She's a beautiful woman, Mom. Young, exciting, everything that." He never got to finish that sentence because that's when his mother slapped him. The sound echoed across the silent yard like a gunshot. Sheila Evans had never struck another person in her 73 years of life. She was the epitome of old-fashioned grace, a woman who believed in proper manners, social decorum, and handling family business behind closed doors. But watching her eldest son casually dismiss his wife while bragging about his young mistress had apparently pushed her past every boundary of civilized behavior. "How dare you?" she whispered, her hand still raised from the slap, trembling with rage and heartbreak. "How dare you speak about your wife like that, about any woman like that?" Corey stumbled backward, one hand pressed to his reddening cheek, his expression a mixture of shock and wounded pride. "Mom, you don't understand what it's been like." "I understand perfectly," she cut him off, her voice gaining strength with each word. I understand that I raised a son who thinks marriage is disposable, who thinks loyalty is optional, who thinks humiliating the woman who supported his career for 5 years is appropriate dinner entertainment. She turned to face me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Bridget, I am so deeply sorry for what he's done to you, for what he's put you through, for ever making you feel like you weren't good enough for this family. The apology hit me harder than any of Corey's quilty had. This woman who'd spent years making subtle comments about my domestic skills, my career choices, my failure to produce grandchildren, was publicly acknowledging that the failure in our marriage wasn't mine. Thank you, I managed, my voice thick with emotion I hadn't expected to feel. But I wasn't finished. The sympathy was touching, but sympathy wasn't going to protect me from what Corey would try to do next. He was wounded now, desperate, and desperate people do unpredictable things. Actually, I said, raising my voice to address the entire crowd again, there's something else everyone should know about our finances. Corey's head snapped up, his eyes wide with something that looked like genuine panic. Bridget, don't. For the past 6 months, I continued, pulling out my phone again, Corey has been systematically moving our joint assets into accounts that only have his name on them. Our savings, our investment portfolio, even changing his payroll deposits to a new bank I didn't know existed. I held up screenshots of bank statements, transfer authorizations, account opening documents, all with Corey's signature, all dated within the past year.
He's been planning this divorce for a long time, I said, and he's been planning to leave me with as little as possible. The hotel receipts I found show he's spent over $30,000 of our joint money on his affair. The jewelry, the trips, the expensive dinners, all funded by money we both earned but only he controlled. The crowd was getting angry now, really angry. These weren't just abstract moral failures anymore. This was theft, betrayal of the most fundamental kind. Several people were shaking their heads in disgust, and I could hear muttered comments about stealing from his own wife, and what kind of man does that? But here's what Corey didn't know, I said, my voice warming with genuine satisfaction. I've been planning too. I pulled out another set of documents, ones I'd been saving for exactly this moment. These are copies of everything. Every transfer, every hidden account, every forged signature on documents that required both our authorizations. All documented, all illegal, all admissible in court. Corey went very still. You can't prove. I can prove all of it, I interrupted, because unlike you, I actually read the documents I sign, including our original prenuptial agreement. The word prenuptial sent a visible shock through the crowd. Most people didn't know we had one, and from the expression on Corey's face, he'd forgotten I knew about some of the clauses it contained. Section 12, I said, reading from a printed copy I pulled from my purse. Any spouse who engages in financial deception or adultery forfeits their claim to assets acquired during the marriage. Corey's face went ashen. That clause is unenforceable. Actually, said a new voice from the edge of the crowd, it's completely enforceable under California law. Everyone turned to see a woman in a sharp business suit walking toward us with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. She was tall, elegant, with the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. Jennifer Walsh, she said, extending her hand to me while completely ignoring Corey. Your attorney. Sorry I'm late. Traffic was murder-deading here. I'd called Jennifer that morning after my final review of all the evidence I'd collected. She was a specialist in high-asset divorces involving adultery and financial fraud, and her reputation for destroying cheating spouses was legendary. Miss Walsh, I said, shaking her hand formally, perfect timing. Jennifer turned to address the crowd with the kind of calm authority that made courtrooms go silent. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for interrupting this lovely party, but I have some papers that Mr. Evans needs to see. She pulled a thick envelope from her briefcase and held it out to Corey, who looked like he'd rather handle a live snake. Restraining order on all marital assets, she said crisply, effective immediately.
Also, notice of intent to file criminal charges for financial fraud and theft of marital property. The crowd was completely silent now, watching this legal drama unfold like a particularly engrossing television show. And finally, Jennifer continued, a counter-petition for divorce that includes a request for full asset forfeiture under the prenuptials adultery clause. She smiled at Corey with the kind of expression that probably haunted his nightmares. Congratulations, Mr. Evans. You just lost everything. The silence that followed Jennifer's announcement was so complete, I could hear the string lights humming overhead. 50 people stood frozen, watching Corey process the reality that his carefully orchestrated evening had just become the most expensive mistake of his life. This is insane, he said, his voice cracking like a teenager. You can't just, this is all based on, she's been spying on me. Actually, Jennifer replied with the patience of someone explaining basic arithmetic to a difficult child, this is all based on evidence your wife legally obtained of your systematic financial fraud and adultery. The prenuptial agreement you signed explicitly states that infidelity voids your claim to marital assets. Your own text messages document the affair. Your own bank records show the unauthorized transfers. She opened her briefcase again and pulled out another document. Oh, and there's one more thing. Mrs. Evans isn't financially dependent on you anymore. Jennifer handed me a contract, and I held it up for everyone to see. 6-figure consulting deal with Morrison Marketing Group, I announced, signed this afternoon, effective Monday morning. The irony was perfect. Morrison Marketing Group was Corey's biggest client, the account that had earned him his last promotion. They'd approached me 3 weeks ago after seeing some of my freelance work, offering me a position that came with a salary higher than what Corey made as regional manager. I start as their new creative director on Monday, I continued. Funny thing about working in marketing, you develop relationships with clients, relationships that sometimes outlast the account managers who originally brought you together. Corey's face cycled through several emotions before settling on something that looked like pure panic. You can't work for Morrison. That's a conflict of interest. I'll report you to... To who? Jennifer interrupted smoothly. Your wife doesn't work for your company, Mr. Evans. She's a freelance contractor who's perfectly free to work for any client she chooses, including clients who've become concerned about the moral character of their current account management team. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Morrison Marketing Group hadn't just offered me a job. They heard rumors about Corey's behavior and were distancing themselves from the potential scandal. Besides, I added, I won't be Mrs. Evans much longer. I'll be going back to my maiden name. Bridget Curtis has a nice ring to it, don't you think? That's when Corey finally broke. The careful composure, the business-like demeanor, the smug confidence, all of it cracked like an egg hitting pavement. This is bullshit, he shouted, his voice echoing across the yard. You think you're so smart, but you have no idea what you're doing. You'll never survive without me. You're nothing without me. The outburst was so raw, so desperate, that several people actually stepped backward. This wasn't the charming, successful man they thought they knew. This was someone whose carefully constructed image was disintegrating in real time. You're right, I said quietly, my voice cutting through his hysteria like a knife through silk. I was nothing. For 3 years, you made sure I was nothing. You isolated me from my friends, dismissed my career, made me doubt my own judgment about everything from my appearance to my abilities. I stepped closer to him, close enough that I could see the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. But here's what you never understood, Corey. I wasn't nothing before I met you. And now that I remember who I used to be, I'm going to be something again. Something you can't control, can't diminish, can't manipulate. His eyes darted around the crowd, looking for support that clearly wasn't coming. His colleagues were avoiding eye contact. His friends were studying their phones. Even his family looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. Mom, he said suddenly, turning to Sheila with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for a life preserver. Mom, you know I'm not a bad person. I made some mistakes, but... You didn't make mistakes, Sheila said, her voice cold as winter. You made choices. Calculated, deliberate choices to betray your wife, steal from your marriage, and humiliate someone who loved you. Those aren't mistakes, Corey. That's character. She turned to face me one more time. Bridget, I hope you'll consider keeping in touch. Not because of him, she gestured dismissively at her son, but because you've shown more grace and strength tonight than most people manage in a lifetime. The crowd was beginning to disperse now, the drama having reached its natural conclusion. People were saying quiet goodbyes to me, offering support, expressing their shock and sympathy. Several friends pressed business cards into my hand, promising to call with job leads or just to catch up. But as the yard emptied and the catering staff began cleaning up, I found myself standing alone with Corey for the first time all evening. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the loss of his audience and his illusions. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I never meant for it to happen like this. Yes, you did, I replied. You planned every detail. You just planned for a different ending. He nodded slowly, the fight finally gone out of him. What happens now? I looked around at the beautiful backyard, at the string lights that would be taken down tomorrow, at the remnants of a party that had become something neither of us had expected. Now, I said, I start over, and you figure out what kind of man you want to be when nobody's watching. I turned and walked toward the house, leaving him standing alone under the lights he'd hung to illuminate my humiliation. But as I reached the back door, I heard him call my name one last time. Bridget? I turned back. Happy birthday. For the first time in 3 years, it really was. 6 months later, I was sitting in my new corner office at Morrison Marketing Group, watching the San Francisco skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, when my assistant buzzed me with an unexpected call. Bridget, there's a Sheila Evans online too. She says it's personal. I hadn't spoken to Corey's mother since the divorce was finalized 3 months ago. The prenuptial agreement had held up perfectly in court. Corey lost everything except his clothing and personal items. The house, the investments, even his precious wine collection had become mine under the adultery clause he'd forgotten existed. Sheila, I said, picking up the line, how are you? I'm well, dear. I hope you don't mind me calling at work. I got your number from Marianne. Of course she had. My sister had become unexpectedly close to Corey's mother after the party, bonding over their shared disbelief at his behavior. I wanted to let you know, Sheila continued, that Corey and that girl broke up. I felt nothing, not satisfaction, not vindication, not even mild interest. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? Because I'm not. Apparently, she wasn't interested in dating a man who lost his job, his house, and his reputation, all in the same week. That did surprise me. He lost his job. Morrison dropped his company as a client after what happened at your party. Without that account, his firm had to make cuts. Guess who was first to go? The irony was almost too perfect. Corey had lost his career because the same client who'd hired me had decided they couldn't work with someone who displayed such poor character in public. He's been calling me, Sheila said quietly, asking for money, asking me to talk to you about a reconciliation, asking if I think there's any way to undo the divorce settlement. And what do you tell him? I tell him that actions have consequences, and that maybe losing everything will teach him something about how to treat people. I could hear the sadness in her voice. Despite everything, Corey was still her son. How are you doing? I asked. Really? Better than I expected. It's been liberating, actually, not having to pretend that boy was the man I thought I'd raised. And you? You sound happy. I looked around my office, at the awards on my walls from campaigns I'd designed, at the view of a city where I'd built a life entirely my own. I am happy, I said, and realized it was completely true. We talked for a few more minutes about safe topics, her garden, my work, Marianne's upcoming wedding, before saying goodbye. After I hung up, I sat quietly for a moment, thinking about the woman I'd been at that birthday party and the woman I'd become since then. The scared, diminished wife who'd been afraid to voice her own opinions was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned that the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting better. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant. "Your 3 p.m. is here. The Morrison team is ready to present the campaign you designed." I smiled, straightened my red blazer, the same color as the dress that had started everything, and walked into the conference room to present the work that had just won us the biggest client in the company's history. It really had been a very happy birthday, after all.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.